Hello, I greet you in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm continuing with my exposition or my filming of 7 videos that are taking up 7 questions that are addressed at the current debate surrounding New Testament textual criticism here in Brazil and Family 35. This is the last of the 7 topics. It's the oldest manuscripts are not the best. What follows has been copied from my book, The Identity of the New Testament Text, that was first published in 1977, with a few additions. Anyone wishing to check the references should consult that book. If you don't have the book, you can download it free from my website, crunch.org. John Bergen recognized the antecedent probability with these words, quote, "The more ancient testimony is probably the better testimony. That it is not by any means always so is a familiar fact. But it remains true, notwithstanding, that until evidence has been produced to the contrary, in any particular instance, the more ancient of 2 witnesses may reasonably be presumed to be the better informed witness." End quote. Now, that a priori expectation seems to have been elevated to a virtual certainty in the minds of many textual critics of the 19th century. The basic ingredient in the works of men like Tregelles and Tischendorf and Hort was a deference to the oldest manuscripts. And in this they followed Lachmann. Zuntz refers to Lachmann like this: "The best attestation," so Lachmann maintained, "is given by the oldest witnesses." Taking his stand rigorously with the oldest and disregarding the whole of the recent evidence, he drew the consequences of Bengel's observations. The material which Lachmann used could with advantage have been increased, but the principle that the text of the New Testament, like that of every other critical edition, must throughout be based upon the best available evidence, was once and for all established by him. End quote. Note that Zuntz here clearly equates oldest with best, which we reject. He evidently exemplifies what Oliver, another scholar, has called the, quote, "growing belief that the oldest manuscripts contain the most nearly original text," end quote. Oliver goes on to say the following, quote, "Some recent critics have returned to the earlier pattern of Tischendorf and Westcott and Hort to seek for the original text in the oldest manuscripts. Critics earlier in the 20th century were highly critical of this 19th century practice. The return has been motivated largely by the discovery of papyri, which are separated from the autographs by less than 2 centuries, end quote. But the contrary evidence is in hand. We have already seen that the most significant variants had come into being by the year 200, before the time of the earliest extant manuscripts, therefore. The a priori presumption in favor of age is nullified by the known existence of a variety of deliberately altered texts in the 2nd century. Each witness must be evaluated on its own. As Colwell Sowell put it, quote, "The crucial question for early as for late witnesses is still, where do they fit into a plausible reconstruction of the history of the manuscript tradition?" End quote. It is generally agreed that all the earliest manuscripts, the ones upon which our eclectic or so-called critical texts are based, come from Egypt. K.W. Clark said this: "When the textual critic looks more closely at his oldest manuscript materials, the paucity of his resources is more fully realized. All the earliest witnesses, papyrus or parchment, come from Egypt alone. Manuscripts produced in Egypt, ranging between the 3rd and 5th centuries, provide only a half-dozen extensive witnesses." And then he cites them: the Beatty Papyri, the well-known Uncials Vaticanus, Sinaiticus Alexandrinus, Ephraim Syrus, and the Freer Washington, Codex W. And to these, of course, the Bodmer Papyri must now be added. But what are Egypt's claims upon our confidence? And how wise is it to follow the witness of only one locale? Anyone who finds the history of the text presented herein, that's in my book, to be convincing will place little confidence in the earliest manuscripts. And we've already filmed in this series a prior video about qualification, and we showed that Egypt was totally disqualified at all times. Now I come to judging the quality of the earliest manuscripts by themselves, in terms of their own properties. Quite apart from the history of the transmission of the text, the earliest manuscripts bear their own condemnation on their faces. Papyrus 66 is widely considered to be the earliest extensive manuscript. What of its quality? Again, I borrow from E.C. Colwell's study of the Papyrus 45, Papyrus 66, and Papyrus 75. Speaking of, quote, the seriousness of intention of the scribe and the peculiarities of his own basic method of copying, Colwell continues, quote, on these last and most important matters, our three scribes are widely divided. Papyrus 75 and Papyrus 45 seriously intended to produce a good copy, but it is hard to believe that this was the intention of Papyrus 66. The nearly 200 nonsense readings and the 400 itacistic spellings in Papyrus 66 are evidence of something less than disciplined attention to the basic task. To this evidence of carelessness must be added those singular readings whose origin baffles speculation. Readings that can be given no more exact label than carelessness leading to assorted variant readings. A hurried count shows Papyrus 45 with 20 such readings, Papyrus 75 with 57 of them, and Papyrus 66 with 216 purely careless readings. As we have seen, Papyrus 66 has, in addition, more than twice as many leaps from the same to the same as either of the others that was quoting Colwell. Notice, please, that Colwell's study took into account only singular readings. That is to say, readings with no other manuscript support. He found Papyrus 66 to have 400 itacisms plus 482 other singular readings, 40% of which are nonsensical. Quote, Papyrus 66 editorializes as he does everything else in a sloppy fashion, end quote. That's Colwell. In short, Papyrus 66 is a very poor copy, and yet it is one of the earliest. Papyrus 75 is placed close to Papyrus 66 in date. Although not as bad as Papyrus 66, it is scarcely a good copy. Colwell found Papyrus 75 to have about 145 itacisms plus 257 other singular readings, 25% of which are nonsensical. Although Colwell gives the scribe of Papyrus 75 credit for having tried to produce a good copy, Papyrus 75 looks good only by comparison with Papyrus 66. Look, if you were asked to write out the Gospel of John by hand, would you make over 400 mistakes? Huh? Would you? Try to see. It should be kept in mind that the figures offered by Colwell deal only with errors which are the exclusive property of their respective manuscripts. They doubtless contain many other errors which happen to be found in some other witnesses as well. In other words, they are actually worse even than Colwell's figures dictate, which are bad enough. Nor is that all. That is not all. Sorry about that. That is not all. Colwell goes on to say, quote, in general, Papyrus 75 copies letters one by one. Papyrus 66 copies syllables, usually 2 letters in length. Papyrus 45 copies phrases and clauses. The accuracy of these assertions can be demonstrated. That Papyrus 75 copied letters one by one is shown in the pattern of the errors. He has more than 60 readings that involve a single letter, and not more than 10 careless readings that involve a syllable. But Papyrus 66 drops 61 syllables, 23 of them in leaps, and omits as well a dozen articles and 30 short words. In Papyrus 45, there is not one omission of a syllable in a leap, nor is there any list of careless omissions of syllables. Papyrus 45 omits words and phrases, end quote. Now this is very instructive. As a linguist, I have a PhD, I have no qualms in affirming that the persons who produced Papyrus 66 and Papyrus 75 did not know Greek. Had they understood the text, they would not have made the number and sort of mistakes that they did. Just stop and think. When copying a language that you know, you copy phrase by phrase, or at the very least, word by word, not letter by letter. Those manuscripts are old, but they are very poor examples of how to make a copy. They demonstrate that the age of a manuscript does not guarantee quality in copying, nor does it guarantee the quality of its exemplar. Papyrus 45, although a little later in date, will be considered next because it is the third member in Colwell's study. He found Papyrus 45 to have approximately 90 iticisms plus 275 other singular readings, 10% of which are nonsensical. However, Papyrus 45 is shorter than Papyrus 66. Papyrus 75 is longer, and so is not comparatively so much better as the figures might suggest at first glance. Colwell comments upon Papyrus 45 as follows, quote, "Another way of saying this is that when the scribe of Papyrus 45 creates a singular reading, it almost always makes sense. When the scribes of Papyrus 66 and Papyrus 75 create singular readings, they frequently do not make sense and are obvious errors. Thus, Papyrus 45 must be given credit for a much greater density of intentional changes than the other two. As an editor, the scribe of Papyrus 45 wielded a sharp axe. The most striking aspect of his style is its conciseness. The dispensable word is dispensed with. He omits adverbs, adjectives, nouns, participles, verbs, personal pronouns, without any compensating habit of addition. He frequently omits phrases and clauses. He prefers the simple to the compound word. In short, he favors brevity. He shortens the text in at least 50 places in singular readings alone. But he does not drop syllables or letters. His shortened text is readable." End quote. Of special significance is the possibility of affirming with certainty that the scribe of Papyrus 45 deliberately and extensively shortens the text. Colwell credits him with having tried to produce a good copy. Well, if by good he means readable, okay, fine. But if by good we mean a faithful reproduction of the original, then Papyrus 45 is bad. Since Papyrus 45 contains many deliberate alterations, it can only be called a copy with certain reservations. Papyrus 46, this is another one. Papyrus 46 is thought by some to be as early as Papyrus 66. Zundt's study of this manuscript is well known. Quote, "In spite of its neat appearance, it was written by a professional scribe and corrected but very imperfectly by an expert. Papyrus 46 is by no means a good manuscript. The scribe committed very many blunders. My impression is that he was liable to fits of exhaustion." End quote. It should be remarked in passing that Codex B is noted for its neat appearance also, but it should not be assumed that therefore it must be a good copy. Zunz goes on to say, quote, "Papyrus 46 abounds with scribal blunders, omissions, and also additions." And a different quote, same man, "The scribe who wrote the papyrus did his work very badly. Of his innumerable faults, only a fraction, less than 1 in 10, have been corrected, and even that fraction, as often happens in manuscripts, grows smaller and smaller towards the end of the book. Whole pages have been left without any correction, however greatly they were in need of it." End quote. Herman C. Hoskier also has discussed the, quote, "large number of omissions which disfigure Papyrus 46. Again, Zunz says, quote, "We have observed that, for example, the scribe of Papyrus 46 was careless and dull and produced a poor representation of an excellent tradition. Nor can we ascribe the basic excellence of this tradition to the manuscript from which Papyrus 46 was copied. We shall see that it too was faulty. End quote. It's interesting to note that Zuntz feels able to declare that the parent of P46, Papyrus 46, to be faulty also. But that Papyrus 46 represents an excellent tradition, as he said, is a gratuitous assertion based on Hort's theory. What is incontrovertible is that Papyrus 46, as it stands, is a very poor copy, as Zuntz himself has emphatically stated. Courtauld says concerning Papyrus 47, this is another one, contains the Apocalypse, quote, "We need not mention the fact that the oldest manuscript does not necessarily have the best text. Papyrus 47 is, for example, by far the oldest of the manuscripts containing the full or almost full text of the Apocalypse. But it is certainly not the best," end quote, Courtauld. I now go on to another topic. We're going to judge the quality of those early manuscripts between themselves. We're going to throw one against the other. As for codices B and Aleph, we have already noted Hoskier's statement that those two manuscripts disagree over 3,000 times just in the space of the four Gospels. Now, simple logic imposes the conclusion that one or the other must be wrong over 3,000 times. That is, they have over 3,000 mistakes between them. Look, if you were to write out the four Gospels, by hand, do you suppose that you could manage to make 3,000 mistakes? Or even 1,500? Aleph and B disagree on the average in almost every verse of the Gospels. Such a showing seriously undermines their credibility. John Burgon personally collated what in his day were the 5 old uncials, that is, Aleph, A, B, C, and D. Throughout his works, he repeatedly calls attention to what he called the Concordia Discourse, the prevailing confusion and disagreement, which the early uncials display between themselves. Luke 11, chapter 11, verses 2 through 4, offers one example. Quote, "The 5 old uncials, that's Aleph, A, B, C, D, falsify the Lord's Prayer as given by St. Luke in no less than 45 words. But so little do they agree among themselves that they throw themselves into 6 different combinations in their departures from the traditional text. And yet they are never able to agree among themselves as to one single various reading, while only once are more than 2 of them observed to stand together, and their grand point of union is no less than the omission of the article. Such is their eccentric tendency that in respect of 32 out of the whole 45 words, they bear in turn solitary evidence." End quote. Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12 offers another example. Again, Burgon, I'm quoting Burgon, quote, "In the course of those 12 verses, there will be found to be 60 variations of reading. Now, in the present instance, the, quote, 5 old uncials, end quote, cannot be the depositories of a tradition, whether Western or Eastern, because they render inconsistent testimony in every verse. It must be further admitted, for this is really not a question of opinion, but a plain matter of fact, that it is unreasonable to place confidence in such documents. What would be thought in a court of law of 5 witnesses called up 47 times for examination, who should be observed to bear contradictory testimony every time?" End quote. Even Hort had occasion to notice an instance of this Concordia Discourse, commenting on the 4 places in Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 30, 68, and verse 72, 2 times, where the cock's crowing is mentioned. He, that's Hort, said, quote, "The confusion of attestation introduced by these several cross-currents of change is so great that of the 7 principal manuscripts, that's Aleph, A, B, C, D, L, and Delta, no 2 have the same text in all 4 places," end quote. He might also have said that in those 4 places, the 7 uncials present themselves in 12 different combinations, and only A and delta agree together 3 times out of the 4. Now really, are such witnesses worthy of credence? Recalling Colwell's effort to reconstruct an Alexandrian archetype for chapter 1 of Mark, just one chapter, either Codex B is wrong 34 times in that one chapter, or else a majority of the remaining primary Alexandrian witnesses is wrong, which really, does nasty things to the pretensions of the Alexandrian text. And so for Aleph and L and so on. Further, Kenyon, another scholar, no friend of the received text, Kenyon admitted that Codex B is, quote, disfigured by many blunders in transcription, end quote. And Scrivener said of Codex B, quote, one marked feature characteristic of this copy is the great number of its omissions. That no small portion of these are mere oversights of the scribe seems quite evident from the circumstance that the same scribe has repeatedly written words and clauses twice over, a class of mistakes which my and the collators have seldom thought fit to notice, but which by no means enhances our estimate of the care employed in copying this venerable record of primitive Christianity, end quote. Even Hort, marvel of marvel, even Hort conceded that the scribe of B, quote, reached by no means a high standard of accuracy, end quote. That was Hort. And Codex Aleph is acknowledged on every side to be worse than B in every way, worse than Codex B. As for Codex D, Beza, it is in a class by itself. Scrivener, quote, the internal character of the Codex Beza is a most difficult and indeed an almost inexhaustible theme. No known manuscript contains so many bold and extensive interpolations. 600, it is said, in the Acts alone. Mr. Harris, from curious internal evidence, such as the existence in the text of a vitiated rendering of a verse of Homer, which bears signs of having been retranslated from a Latin translation, infers, as Mr. Harris infers, that the Greek has been made up from the Latin, end quote from Scrivener. Hort spoke of, quote, the prodigious amount of error which Codex D contains, end quote. John Bergen concluded that D resembles a targum more than a transcription. I now go to another question, the quality of those early manuscripts as judged by the ancient church. If these are our best manuscripts, we may as well agree with those who insist that the recovery of the original wording is impossible and turn our minds to other pursuits. But the evidence indicates that the earliest manuscripts are the worst. Not the best, they're the worst. It is clear that the church in general did not propagate the sort of text found in the earliest manuscripts, which demonstrates that they were not held in high esteem in their day. Consider the so-called Western text type. In the Gospels, it is represented by essentially one Greek manuscript, Codex Beza, or Codex D, or 05, plus the Latin versions, but only sort of. So much so that for many years, no critical text has used a cover symbol for the so-called Western text. In fact, Kurt and Barbara Allant now refer to it simply as the D text. Their designation is objective, at least. The Church Universal simply refused to copy or otherwise propagate that type of text. No thank you. Nor can the Latin Vulgate legitimately be claimed for the so-called Western text. It is actually more Byzantine than anything else. And remember, it was translated in the 4th century. Now consider the so-called Alexandrian text type. In more recent times, neither the United Bible Society nor the Nestle Aland text use a cover symbol for this so-called text. Not it either. Not the Western, not the Alexandrian. They only do so for the Byzantine. Frederick Missa collated and analyzed 1,386 manuscripts for chapters 1, 10, and 20 of Luke, 3 complete chapters. On the basis of shared mosaics of readings, he was able to group the manuscripts into families. 15 major groups, and 22 lesser ones. One of the major ones he calls Egyptian or Alexandrian. It is made up of precisely 4 uncials and 4 cursives, plus another 2 of each that are Egyptian in one of the 3 chapters. Rounding up to 10, that makes 10 out of 1,386. That's less than 1% of manuscripts that can be attributed to the so-called Alexandrian text type. Look, again, the Church Universal simply refused to copy or otherwise propagate that type of text. Codex B has no children, no copies. Codex Aleph has no children. In fact, they're so bad that across the centuries, something like 14 different people worked on it, trying to fix it up. But no one copied it. No, thank you. Recall Kovill's study wherein he tried to arrive at the archetype of the Alexandrian text in chapter 1 of Mark on the basis of 13 manuscripts supposed to represent that type of text. They were so disparate that he discarded the 7 worst ones and then tried his experiment using the remaining 6. Even then, the results were so bad, Codex B diverged from the mean text 34 times just in one chapter, that Covill threw up his hands and declared that such an archetype never existed. If Covill is correct, then the so-called Alexandrian text type cannot represent the autograph. The autograph is the ultimate archetype, and it did indeed exist. So if you're going to be a candidate for the original, you have to be an archetype, which the Alexandrian text is not. They don't have. Consider one more detail. Sluntz says of the scribe of Papyrus 46, of his innumerable faults, only a fraction, less than 1 in 10, have been corrected, and even that fraction, as often happens in manuscripts, grows smaller and smaller towards the end of the book. Whole pages have been left without any correction, however greatly they were in need of it, end quote. A similar thing happens in Papyrus 66. Why? Probably because the corrector lost heart. He gave up. Perhaps he saw that the transcription was so hopelessly bad that no one would want to use it, even if he could patch it up. It should also be noted that although many collations and discussions of manuscripts ignore error, to a person in the year 250 wishing to use a copy for a devotional study or whatever, errors in spelling would be just as annoying and distracting as more serious ones. A copy like Papyrus 66 with roughly 2 mistakes every verse would be set aside in disgust. I myself recently collated cursive 789 that's in the National Library of Greece in Athens. I did that for John. I'd already done it for Luke. I'm talking about John now. Although the copyist made an occasional mistake, I judged that his exemplar was a very nearly perfect representative of Family 35. However, cursive 789 is presently lacking from John chapter 19, verse 12 to the end. A later hand 789 supplement has chapter 19, verse 26 to the end. But that copyist was a terrible speller, averaging nearly 1 mistake every verse. It's reminiscent of Papyrus 66, although 66 is worse, averaging about 2 mistakes every verse. I found myself becoming angry with the copyist. I was prepared to call down curses on his head. Assuming that the cause of the mistakes was ignorance rather than perversity, the copyist should not have undertaken a task for which he was so pitifully unqualified. It would be psychologically impossible for me to use cursive 789 supplement for devotion or study. I would simply become too angry to continue. The same holds for Papyrus 66 or 45 or what have we. To read it, I would simply get too mad. I couldn't do it. Psychologically impossible. Further, how could the early manuscripts survive for 1,500 years if they had been used? I've worn out several Bibles all by myself in my short life. Considering the relative difficulty of acquiring copies in those days, as they were expensive, done by hand, any worthy copy would have been used until it wore out. I myself continue to insist that most of the early manuscripts survived because they were intolerably bad. They were intolerably bad. It was psychologically impossible to use them, besides being a criminal waste of good parchment to copy them. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching. God bless.